Welcome to Top of Mind, the show where we talk to real estate industry insiders and experts about the biggest trends impacting the market today. Enjoy the show.
Mike Simonson here. Thanks for joining me today. Welcome to the Top of Mind podcast. This is where I talk to the smartest leaders, thinkers, doers in the real estate industry. For a couple of years now, we've been sharing our latest market data every week in our weekly video series. With the new Top of Mind podcast, we're looking to add some more context to the discussion about what's happening in the market from the leaders, of people who have very different perspective maybe than we do. Each week, Altos tracks every home for sale in the country, all the pricing, all the supply and demand, all the changes in that data, and we make it available to you before you see it in the traditional channels. People desperately need to know what's happening in the housing market right now. It's been so hot, so competitive, and now suddenly the landscape is maybe changing. So when people ask me, Mike, can I get the data for my local market? The answer is yes. Go to altosresearch.com. You can book a free consultation how you use market data in your business. Okay, without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce my guest today, Adam Ozimek. Adam is the Chief Economist for the Economic Innovation Group and is an expert in the functioning of labor markets. His research covers a broad array of economic fields, including demographics. We're going to talk about demographics today, monetary policy, immigration, another topic I'm very interested in. He was most recently the Chief Economist at Upwork, where he led research on labor markets, and previously a Senior Economist at Moody's Analytics, where he managed U.S. demographics, forecasts, and research. Adam, welcome to the Top of Mind podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Why don't we start? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Economic Innovation Group and what you're working on there? You just started there, so tell us about that organization and what you're doing.
So the Economic Innovation Group is a think tank that focuses on economic dynamism. So we look at issues like the startup rate, labor dynamism, the amount of churn in the labor market, the sorts of turnover and competitive effects that really drive productivity growth and competition and things like that. So we research, how to make the economy more dynamic and policies that can do that. So, for example, we're major proponents of high-skilled immigration, and we have a policy proposal called Heartland Visas that would allow high-skilled immigrants to move, to parts of the U.S. that are struggling demographically, losing population. Also, proponents of non-compete reform to help there be more churn in the labor market. And also, we do research on NIMBYism too. How do we make the housing market be more dynamic and competitive? So those are just, three policy areas. But broadly, it's like, how do we become and how do we get to be a more dynamic economy and showing why that matters?
Awesome. Well, a lot of cool things in there that I'm interested in. The immigration is one I'm particularly interested in, both from a housing supply standpoint, where there's restricted immigration, restricted home builders, but also in the economic growth sense. I'm curious about the difference between high-skilled immigration and just all immigration, like a free open market there. I'd love to dive in more there. Lots of cool stuff to talk about. Let me start with a question, though. We call the podcast Top of Mind. What's top of mind for you right now?
I mean, one of the most top of mind topics for me is remote work and how that's affecting the economy. It's obviously having a huge impact, not just on businesses, but on housing markets too. And I think we're living through a huge experiment in remote working, and a significant chunk of the economy was thrown into remote work overnight when the pandemic hit. And businesses and workers have found that it works better than they thought. And so a lot of this is going to be permanent. And I think that has huge, huge implications for how we work, where we live, a variety of things. It's what economists call general purpose technology, which means it doesn't just have this one direct effect but it has tons of spillovers that ripple, throughout the economy and the way we live.
A general purpose in the sense, like a shift in the way of adding the CPU into the economy was like that kind of general purpose, like it's impacting all kinds of things.
Exactly. You wouldn't say like, oh, computers did this one thing, right? Computers did so many things, and they affected, not just home production and business production, but like up and down the supply chain. Every part of the economy touches. Electrification is another example. Automobiles, combustion engines. You can think of a lot of examples. I think, I wouldn't go so far as to say that we know that we're living through a new industrial revolution. That would be premature, but I do think that there's a possibility that could happen. But that's how big of a technological change this could be.
That's amazing. Like, I wouldn't say that it's like the Industrial Revolution, but I say might be like the Industrial Revolution. That's incredible. And I read your research recently. You said that that you're expecting 40 million Americans to go to fully remote work.
Yeah, so about 1 out of 5 workers, I think, is going to be full-time remote, and then another 15% will be what you call hybrid remote, which is sometimes in the office, sometimes not.
And so 15%, so only 15% there. That my personal experience. Everybody around me is like 100% is hybrid. So, but I suppose what a surprise! My little San Francisco bubble is not representative of the world. But tell me about why it's only 15%.
Well, early on in the pandemic, a couple of labor economists did an estimate of how many jobs can potentially be done at home. And like they were looking at the characteristics of the work, said, okay, based on the way that each, all these different occupation categories work, the things they have to do, 37% is like the theoretical maximum that can work at home. And so like to be saying like around 35% is, compared to what you would have thought based on the characteristics of work and what seemed like the necessary conditions for working, it's quite high. I mean, there's a lot of part of the economy that is just necessarily in person, leisure and hospitality, retail, construction, a lot of manufacturing. You add these up, it becomes a significant chunk of the economy. And so I think probably around 35%, at least in the short run.
35% that are either fully at home, fully remote, or hybrid.
Yeah,
that's that is significant. And where were we pre-pandemic, roughly?
So there's a lot of discrepancies, different ways to measure it. It's actually not measured particularly well.
Nobody cared.
It just even when they do care, so the BLS is trying to measure remote work now, and their estimate's like 13% is working remote, but like they're way off. They're I have a paper that just put out recently showed that the real number is closer to like currently like probably around 50% are still working at least partially remote. So like it's a tough thing to measure. It depends how you ask, what you're talking about, but pre-pandemic something maybe like 5 to 8% were working like full-time remote, and then maybe like another 10% part-time remote.
Yeah. Does that do those numbers shift with job creation? Like, is there evidence that the jobs that are getting created are remote, or are they in like on premises somewhere? Is there a trend?
So if you look at job posting data, it has the job posts for like whether it's Indeed or ZipRecruiter or whoever, they all show that Burning Glass data too. They all show that the percent of jobs mentioning remote work keeps going up and up and up and up and up and up. So that is suggesting that it's not just like existing jobs being transferred to remote. It's like new jobs being hired into it as well.
That's amazing. So let's talk about some of the implications of that. What do you think? What are the first things we should be thinking about as the implications of that?
Well, let's talk about geography. Since it's a housing podcast, we'll go there. I think that the two types of remote work have different implications for economic geography. So if you think about hybrid remote first, what does that mean? It means that, you're in the office a few days a week. And so the maximum distance that you're willing to commute goes up, right? Like if you got to be in the office 5 days a week, you know, you probably gonna want to keep it to like an hour, over an hour one direction is a pretty significant commute to do. I've done it, so I know. But if you're only having to be in 2 days a week, that makes a longer commute much more doable, or even like 1 day a week or something like that. So what that does basically is it like expands the commuting zone, right? So if this is like the downtown, this is how far you used to be willing to drive. So this was your effective labor market. Now your labor market's that big, right? You've gone from like 1 hour to 2 hours, right? And it's a significant increase in the area that constitutes your labor market. And that then means that like the housing markets that used to be seen as isolated from good jobs now are seen as having access to good jobs. So the clearest place to see this is if you look at areas that are like 2 to 3 to 4 hours outside of New York City, and they were previously low cost areas. So Southern New York State and northeastern Pennsylvania, if you're familiar with the Pocono region at all. These are areas that were previously fairly low cost, pretty populated, and not super high demand. Now, post pandemic, there's been tremendous amount of pricing pressure there, as people who used to live in Manhattan, which has seen like declining relative house prices. Manhattan goes down, the middle area kind of stays the same, and then farther out, Poconos and northeastern Pennsylvania, they go up. And so that's the first place to look. If you can identify places that are, say, 2 to 3 hours from a major employment center and had low cost of living, that's a pretty strong indicator that demand there is going to go up. Factors that would contribute to that additionally would be nice amenities, right? That's an important thing. And then also, if that job center, people previously were commuting into it, if they were a lot of work from home jobs there, like those are factors that are going to contribute to that. So that's the first place I would look, is that sort of like new ex-urban area.
Yeah, and those ex-urban areas, we tracked in the Hudson Valley. We track it in, I'm in San Francisco, and Lake Tahoe just absolutely exploded. Palm Springs from LA. So what I've been curious about is the permanence of that trend. We had a big surge. And in my little limited experience, though, I know people who they were in San Francisco, they bought in the mountains, they did their pandemic there, they never sold their San Francisco home, and now they're here, or and some of them have moved back. They want like, well, we thought the mountains were going to be good, but really, time to put the kid in school, and so they moved back to the city. What do you think about the permanence of those trends?
So I think the opposite is actually more likely true, that the trends are going to continue to grow. The reason why is because if you think you are temporarily remote, that is going to have a limited impact on your willingness to move somewhere, right? Like most people, some people, like if you got a ton of money, sure, you'll go buy a second house somewhere, you'll live there for a little bit, come back. That's a small fraction of the U.S. economy. Most people, they have one house and then live in that house, and they don't move lightly, right? And they don't move for like a year or two. So I think what's going to happen is people become more sure of their work from home options. That gives them the confidence to move. So if you have a job in Manhattan and you are currently remote, but you don't know whether you're going to be back to the office permanently, maybe your company hasn't made a decision yet. They're just sort of like, we'll see what happens. It's pretty tough to make the decision then to move like 4 hours away or something like that, right? Because you're worried you're going to get fully recalled and then have to come back. Now, say your company gives you an extra bit of surety. They say, we're going to do this forever, right? So don't worry about it. That's a little bit more surety, but it's not total surety, because they may fire you someday, and then you're living in a place where there aren't a lot of local labor market opportunities. Or they may change their mind, right? They may say, this isn't working, we need to bring everybody back. So like, what you need to be certain is not just your employer to make the commitment, but a variety of employers to make the commitment, and to start to feel like the remote labor market is a substantial outside option in and of itself, so that you can take that leap to move places where you don't have the local labor market options. And so for that reason, I think as remote work becomes more settled and more understood in that way, and the opportunities solidify, people are going to say, okay, I can take the riskier move. I can go not just to like, you can go to Hudson Valley, you can go to the Poconos, and then you can go to like Montana. You can go way, way far out where you just don't worry about labor markets at all anymore.
Yeah. And so your research shows that like that, because that is a increasing trend, it's likely to be a sort of a reinforcing cycle.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can see it in the data too. So early on, people were looking at, take California, for example. The California Policy Institute put out a paper in early 2021 that said basically all the moves within California have been relatively short distance. And so really, yes, San Francisco losing population, but they're moving to Fresno, they're moving to other parts of San Francisco. San Francisco is not, or California is not losing population, and the moves are short distance. And that sort of was suggestive of like, perhaps it's a permanent thing, perhaps it's a modest thing, it's not really going to have major impact. They updated their analysis at the end of 2021, and what they found was that moves had increased. People were going farther, they were leaving the state, and they were doing it to the extent that actually the state population was clearly declining. And so what you've seen is the short run effects are smaller than the medium run effects, which I think are going to be smaller than the long run effects. So any place that's sort of like counting on like everyone coming home and amounts of massive bounce back, I think, is being optimistic. Now, it doesn't mean that some places won't see population come back, but I think it's going to come back in the form of lower demand, which necessitates lower prices. So you think of like New York, for example. New York has pretty inelastic housing supply, which means that the demand to live there for the last 2 or 3 decades has been met more by rising prices than by rising quantity. So as demand falls, you're going to find people who want to move to New York on the margin at that lower price, and they find it more affordable when they can. So I think that, New York will see lower prices, potentially smaller population, but not dramatically so. If you look at other places, they may see more of a quantity effect as well. But you also have to think through the ripple effects. Falling prices, they're hard to absorb, That's bad for property tax revenues and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. So that the like the marginal demand is still there, but it's like that. So that we get a shift in population, but we're not going to lose. Manhattan's not likely to lose people, even if maybe San Francisco does, because everybody's moving to New York.
Yeah, that's right. And the adjustment to that lower price population could be painful in the sense that it often takes a while for, markets to clear when prices are falling. And I mean, actually, the high inflationary background we're facing is kind of helpful in that regards. That it should help prices clear a little bit faster. But you still have, you may need to see like changes to real estate, for example. So like people might want to switch to a bigger square footage. So like that's one of the ways that lower prices can manifest in more demand, is that like people will buy more square footage, and that's like an adaptation that takes time. It also has negative property tax implications or negative income tax implications, right? Because like if prices fall such that people are like, all right, I'm willing to move to New York now, but I don't want a 400 square foot apartment, I want an 800 square foot apartment, I'm willing to pay for it now because it's cheaper. It takes a while for the housing stock to adjust, and then you have one less taxpayer than you used to.
Yeah, interesting. And so we called this the phenomenon the Zoom towns, like the places that people move to be on Zoom. And so just to sum that side up, it's like Zoom towns are a long-term trend and likely to keep self-reinforcing there. And does that so one of the things I try to do, and I'll probably bring it up a couple times in this conversation, is we've had such a hot housing market. It's been across all price points, across all geographies. And so one of the things I try to do is I'm looking for signals of when that changes. When, I don't feel, to me, it doesn't feel like a bubble, but there's a powerful trend. And so at some point the trend shifts. Are there seeds in the Zoomtown, in the remote work trend that either finally derail this housing market train or maybe accelerate it?
So the house price growth is like absurd, right? And I think the way that remote work affects house prices is going to be to exacerbate it in the short run, which it has done. And then, but it'll be helpful in the medium to long run, because I think in general, what you're going to see is demand move from places that don't build to places that do build. And so, now the Zoom towns, when you're talking about like a ski area, like that's obviously not an example of a place that will build. But if you're talking about like, a town in North Carolina or, Florida or South, or even, parts of Pennsylvania, these are places that are more likely to build than Manhattan, San Francisco, and the downtown area. So that is a plus for cost of living in the medium to long run.
Got it. Yeah, it's like the arbitrage plays out and those even out long term. So in general, it's kind of, you see it as a bullish factor for the economy.
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, dynamism.
Definitely. And for economic opportunity too, and places that have been sort of falling behind, I think we've had for a few decades now sort of opportunity gets like sucked up by superstar cities, and a handful of places in the country are the places where you kind of feel like you have to move if you really want to have the best opportunities, and you really want to have access to high skilled jobs. So a lot of the country has been losing their college educated workforce as they leave there, move to a handful of superstar cities, and then the rest of the country is left with like both a falling and an increasingly less educated population, because it's the skilled people that are leaving, because skilled people get the biggest premium from living in those cities. I think sort of leaning against that process is going to be something positive, and spreading up economic opportunity across the U.S. is going to be positive. I think it's not good for places when college educated people feel that they have to leave there to pursue opportunity. That's bad for those places, not just because like it's not good for the people who may have wanted to stay there but didn't feel that there was opportunity, but it's worse for those people who are left behind, who now the people who would have been entrepreneurial, who would have been more involved in civic engagement, higher income, higher taxpayers, for those people to be disproportionately leaving, that's an economic problem.
Yeah, for sure. And has been for decades, right?
Yeah.
And so do you think like Erie, Pennsylvania people are going to go, hey, why can I can go live there for super cheap and work remote? And like,
yeah,
you think you'll start seeing some balance out back away from into the Rust Belt?
Yeah, I do. I think that, those are, if you look at a place that was previously losing skilled people because they felt that the labor market opportunities there were not good enough, those are places that are going to, on the margin, see a benefit. Now, it doesn't mean that, Erie, Pennsylvania is going to turn into as desirable of a destination as Orlando, Florida overnight. But that's not what matters when you're talking about what is going to happen on the margin with respect to who leaves and who comes. If it becomes better on the margin, it's better than it was, then it's more of a draw. It they have an easier time retaining people. And that's the other thing. Like, will people leave the cities and go back to these places? But in the long run, part of this is like, will people leave in the first place? And so if they don't feel like they have to leave, that's another way we increase population growth there.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Okay. So that actually, let's shift the discussion to demographics. So one of the big reasons that people have been like, those are demographic shifts. We've got the boomers who are finally the late 70s. We have the millennials who are really driving a huge chunk of our home buyer demand right now. How do demographics fit into the whole thing? And then tell me about any like things we should pay attention to demographically.
So the millennial generation is a very large generation, and this was already going to probably be a period of high housing demand because they are in their sort of peak home ownership, peak household formation years. And so we were already, 2020 through 2025 or whatever, going to be seeing strong demand for housing as a result of that demographic group. So that's like the big demographic factor. But then if you look across groups, there was still a large hangover from the Great Recession in terms of both household formation rates, the propensity to like live on your own, not live with roommates, not live with your parents, and also home ownership rates. So people are, they move out away from roommates, away from parents, step one, and then they become homeowners, step two. Both of those things did not recover fully across demographics groups, not all groups, but most pronounced among the younger groups. But to some extent across most groups, they did not recover from the Great Recession. So I think you're going to see some of that once we get to full employment, and we're getting some of it now with the temporarily strong labor markets. I think that's a positive thing to see home ownership rates return. I think, we were looking at, some of us looked at post Great Recession trends as sort of inevitable and fate, but I think, or like permanent structural. I think that the return to full employment is going to be positive for those trends.
Got it. Yeah, for sure. The millennials have been driving a ton of it now. What do you think about the boomers? And one of their trends is that they stayed in their homes a lot longer than previous generations. They own everything, so by still holding those, they're keeping home price or home inventory down. What do you see happening there? Are we going to get a flood of boomers finally selling when they hit 80?
That's a great question. I think it necessitates sort of post single family options for boomers, right? Or like smaller single family options for boomers. I do think one of the interesting things is, housing sizes have gone up so much over time that like boomers are sitting on fairly large houses. And I do think that might have been one thing that was sort of holding back household formation, that like, it would have been harder for a 30-year-old son to live with his parents in 1960 in a 1960s house where you don't have, space than today when you have like these, not all McMansions, but like, bigger square footage homes with lots of bedrooms, finished basements. It's easier for people to sort of stay with their boomer parents or their boomer siblings or whatever. And so I think that's sort of an interesting fact that's probably held back formation a bit, or made it easier for formation to stay weak.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, you're in your cliche classic story. I had, my 9 siblings in my Queens apartment, and, like, you get out as fast as you can.
That's right.
But then if you're, I have 1.5 siblings, and I'm in my White Plains house, like, it's a little pretty easier. There is a basement that I can live in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating.
I've never seen an empirical study on that. I just find the logic to be pretty compelling.
Yeah, it never occurred to me before, but that's really true. And while there's some fluctuation in home size with the economy, it's not going back, right? We're not shrinking from here.
So it's interesting to think about because the fact that you have so many millennials entering their like prime formation years, I do think that one of the missing markets is the starter home. And so, to the extent that that's about zoning, I think that is something we could, lean against. And that might be something that would reduce the average house size if we sort of got rid of the, floor area ratio requirements and, the kind of zoning things that lend us towards bigger single family homes and allowing smaller things.
You think it's largely zoning that's preventing that the single families from getting built, or is it other building costs like labor and things that all of a sudden you're like, if you're to get anything built is going to cost you, $250K. It's hard to ship a real starter home.
Yeah. So here's what I hope, because you have two periods that are both missing starter homes: the post-recession period and also the pandemic period. My hope is that the post-recession period was all about lack of demand, and the post-pandemic period is simply about that temporary supply problems, and that when things get normalized, the demand is back and then the supply is there, and we can sort of return to a period of more starter homes. That's the optimistic case. The more pessimistic case is the reason that you didn't have starter homes in these two very different periods is a matter of regulation and zoning. So to me, that's to be determined. I hope that the optimistic case proves true.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you think?
Well, so I look at things like the fact that we've had no immigration for a bunch of years, so that we don't have home builders, so that the home builders we do have end up focusing on the higher margin properties. And it's probably a good segue to talk about immigration next, but it's like, I don't see how the prices come down dramatically so that those become really good opportunities for new home builders. Maybe there's some zoning changes, like in California is trying to add, multifamily everywhere. And some of the cities are becoming aware of it, but man, it's really hard for me to envision how it becomes more affordable for builders to build low end and therefore make those good moves. I'm not sure how that math works out.
Well, I think we are still dealing with labor shortages, right? And also, like you said, all sorts of other types of supply shortages. So, that's an area where it would become easier to build low-end houses, right? If those things ease up.
Yeah. So let's talk about labor and labor shortages. I know at the Economic Innovation Group, you are talking about high-skilled labor, a big advocate for high-skilled labor to come into the country. Are home builders high-skilled labor?
I would say typically not. Although even though you'd argue they are. I suppose that some craftsmen would qualify for that. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
There are some real reasons that the cabinet guy is right. He's a real craftsman, and you can't just go, hire a teenage kid to go make cabinets.
So I think to give a slightly more technical answer to that, there's no platonic idea of what high skill means, right? So we can't point to some definite definition that exists. It depends on what context you're talking about. Yeah. And I think there are certainly many senses in which a cabinet maker, craftsman, is high skilled in a lot of ways, right? For the purposes of some immigration policies, though, they may lean on education credentials as the definition of high skill. So to say someone has a bachelor's degree or something like that, and sometimes they might even limit it to be a STEM degree, something like that. So I think in a most realistic, practical sense, what you're describing is correct. That there are a lot of high skilled people in the trades. I think that seems realistically true. Whether immigration policy specifically recognizes that, that would be dependent on policy.
Yeah. Do you so we have a shortage. We have a shortage across all skills right now. And is there any motion in the Biden world that we're going to allow some renewed immigration to help solve some of these things?
If there is, I haven't heard it. So I've not heard much discussion
Yeah.
of you.
No, I like it. It's just so distressing to me. I'm super pro immigration, and I feel like immigrants at all skill levels add value to the economy, and so we should maximize immigration. One question I get, though, especially on Twitter when I espouse my position on maximal immigration, is people ask me about the housing impact. Don't we just make housing worse by letting a bunch more people in?
Yeah.
What do you think about that that argument?
Really great question. Really great question. In normal times, on average, the impact of immigration on house prices is more significant than the impact on wages. And so as a big generalization, yes, that's true. I think it's important to be consistent about that because, this is one reason why post-recession, especially post-house price bust, it didn't make sense to cut immigration to try to strengthen labor markets because that was just going to further weaken housing markets. And post-Great Recession, we were dealing with weak housing markets. And so I argued at the time, and a lot of people did, that we need more immigrants to help boost demand for housing. And that impact was going to be bigger than any impact on wage growth, plus or minus either direction. So I do think, as a generalization, that said, I think that there are some reasons why you could make that not be the case, and the reasons why it would not necessarily always be the case. I think we are now dealing with some acute shortages in some areas, and that that's labor is short relative to demand in those areas. And if you could help increase output in those areas because of the sort of part of the supply curve that you're on, if you can increase output, you could have pretty strong deflationary impacts. So I do think that there is a case to be made that if you can get immigrants in who are in the acute shortage areas, that the impact on prices would be to reduce them rather than to increase them. The other factor is also that I think immigrants tend to, on their own, go towards cities, more dense cities, and that's going to be places where they tend to build less, and so the impact on house prices is going to be higher. Versus if they were to embrace like a heartland visa proposal, which is what I've written about it at EIG, that allows immigrants to move to places that are demographically struggling, and that's going to have a more positive sum impact on house prices because those are going to be places where house prices have fallen, where you have high vacancy rates, issues like that.
Neat. I do like the concept of heartland visa. I'm an immigration maximalist, so anywhere we can knock it down and get them into.
Yeah, exactly. More of every type,
Yeah. Okay, that's really fascinating. Let's shift gears let's talk about the future. The next significant things that we should be paying attention to in the next 2, 3, 5 years. What do you see on the horizon, economically, or maybe even specifically to housing?
So, my hope, if I can think about the optimistic case for the future, my hope is that we can get through the inflationary problems that we're dealing with now more smoothly than we have been, and get to a place where we are at full employment. where labor markets are genuinely tight and not tight in a way that's like acute and temporary. Like it's not really actually a recipe for progress for businesses to be unable to produce just their normal amount of output, to be dealing with screaming labor shortages, right? Like that's not, it was one of the, I think the biggest mistakes of the Biden administration was when businesses were saying we have a labor shortage problem, they mistook that as being a sign of, oh, good, like the labor market's healthy. Not all labor shortages are healthy. And they sort of like had a knee-jerk reaction, which is like, oh, businesses are complaining they can't find workers. That's good. Like, let's ignore it. Just pay more. Like, that's not a solution to acute shortages at normal demand, or like, demand was elevated too. So that was part of the problem. But like, I think that what we need is really tight labor markets due to everyone being back at work, right? Like, so people aren't like on the sidelines, but they actually have jobs. And even though everyone who wants a job has one, then we also have tight labor markets on top of that. And so that we're producing, above and beyond the amount of output that we were, you have a genuinely tight, sustainably tight economy in a way that it's not going to like, you're going to have an increase in labor supply and then wages are going to have to fall. And like, it's just, that's the genuinely healthy labor market I hope we can get to. And I think if we can do that, do it on a sustainable basis, because we've gotten better at monetary and fiscal policy, that I think that's going to generate a lot of positive spillovers for the economy that people aren't necessarily expecting. And I think we're getting some samples of that, some tastes of that today in like the housing markets and consumer durables. Like, this is what a more normal economy is going to look like when we're actually at full employment. People were sort of tricked by the post-Great Recession era about what normal should look like. And I don't think that that was normal. I think that that was a hangover, and we can get beyond that hangover.
That's really amazing. So, so you said if we can get past the current inflation challenges, because we are smarter at monetary and fiscal policy. Do you believe that we are smarter at monetary and fiscal policy, sort of in general right now? Have we grown there?
Yes and no. So we learned one important mistake from the long recovery from the Great Recession, and now we're learning another mistake, right?
The mistake and the Great Recession is that we underspent for that.
We underspent. That was the first mistake, not fiscal spending, but then we also started raising rates way too early. Like, we were raising rates, 2015, when the economy was clearly, 2019 pre-pandemic, we weren't at full employment yet. So we started raising rates at least 4 years before the economy had reached full employment. Huge mistake, all about underestimating the potential of the economy and mistaking temporary problems for permanent problems.
And you said we were not at full employment because unemployment was still falling, but inflation wasn't rising. So
that's right.
So like, you're like, there's still room to go until we hit an inflection point.
That's right. So, maybe we had another 2 years left, which means that, we would just be in 2021 would have been hitting full employment. Maybe 2020, something like that. Like, so that means we had started raising rates, 6-7 years before full employment. Think of how crazy that sounds now, right? In retrospect. And I think people get that. Certainly the Fed gets it. Now, of course, we've had to learn a little bit of mistakes on the other side too, which is that yes, you can spend too much too fast. And, now we just have to have a more holistic view that it's possible to spend too little. It's possible to spend too much. Don't underestimate the economy. But also don't try to push GDP to 7% above potential in one quarter,
Yeah.
Which is, right. Frankly, was not a lesson that I think we needed to have. I think both times, I think they were avoidable mistakes, unfortunately. But my hope is that on the other side of two very different shocks, two very different policy mistakes that we'll have learned.
That's okay. So, and right now though, we're in big inflation, and we're also in a tightening cycle, right? We're starting to tighten into it. Are you? What do you think about recession? Like, we're almost inverted on our yield curve? Is recession coming? We're going to just hike our way into it?
I would say pre-Ukraine, I was pretty optimistic. So I think that pre-Ukraine, we really were about to be entering a durables turn, where the durables boom turned into a mild durables bust. I think some of the spending on durables was new household formation. But we really didn't build that many new houses. We didn't build that many new apartments. So it's not that much formation. We didn't have the capacity to absorb that much formation. So I think a lot of the durable spending was pulling from the future. And so when you pull from the future, that's eventually going to come back to bite you with lower demand at some point. I think that that's the period we were getting ready to enter. And I hope we are getting ready to enter it. Because when you're at that part of the supply curve where you're just like prices, you're not making that much more, and you're just bidding prices up, it's sort of, you ride that up and you ride it back down, right? You ride up the vertical supply curve, you ride it back down. And my hope would be that a mild durable bust would provide the deflationary pressure we need. Meanwhile, services continue to rebound and are able to absorb any workers displaced from that, and that inflation will normalize. That was my outlook. I'm more concerned now because of the impact of the Ukraine crisis on energy prices. And I would say it's still my view that the durables turn is coming, and that's going to provide the Fed enough comfort. Even if headline inflation remains high, if they see some of these durable prices quickly heading in the right direction, that's going to give them the confidence to not overdo it. But it certainly is a risk that energy prices are going to hit us hard and start spreading throughout the economy and sort of cause the Fed to be concerned that we'd be looking at too long of a period of headline inflation. Even if a lot of that is energy prices, which we're supposed to look through, they're going to worry it's going to become unanchored and they're going to go too fast on the hikes. They're going to cause a mild recession. That's my concern. I'm still think the most likely outcome is the more optimistic one. But if we don't see that durables turn start showing up the next few months, the Fed is going to be, their hand is going to be pretty forced to start raising faster.
Right. So that's the trick. So the durables turn, meaning watching in the inflation numbers, consumer durables, things like washing machines and stuff like that, which have been going nuts, right? Prices so far have been going nuts this year. So we'll be watching for them to start declining. And if they start declining, then that means that the Fed can assume that inflation will be cooling and therefore won't feel as compelled to hike rates.
Correct. The other part of it is, and it'll be one of the things that's helping to drive normalization, is normally when you look at a recovery from a recession, you're seeing the kind of massive job growth that we're seeing. It's a sign that labor demand is getting stronger, which is inflationary because that means wage growth is going to get stronger. But labor demand has been strong for, a year now. What we're seeing, these hundreds of thousands of jobs every month, is not stronger labor demand, it's stronger labor supply, which is totally different than the normal jobs recovery. People are coming back to work. And so that's not going to be inflationary. That's going to be disinflationary, because businesses are going to have an easier time finding the workers they need. They're going to be able to increase output. They're going to be able to not have to pay as much. So declining pressure on wages. So you can't look at your normal business cycle correlations right now. You can't say jobs are growing fast, AKA that's inflationary. It doesn't work when you switch labor demand for labor supply growth.
That's fascinating. So jobs are growing, but they're growing because like some of the boomers who retired early are now unretiring.
Exactly.
Huh. That's super cool. Okay. So then let's say we durables blow through and we have to keep hiking. And then we roll into, you called it a mild recession. This is one of the things on my mind. So is in a mild recession, a recession coming, I assumed when we had the first COVID lockdown, we lost 1 million jobs. I started doing our weekly videos with our data because we assumed the market was going to crash. Everybody's out of work, demand's going to crater, market's going to crash. Yep. It was 3 weeks of crash, and then and then it recovered. So, one of my things I've been kind of publicly speculating about recently is what if in a 2023 recession, the American homeowner says, "Gee, I have a 3% mortgage locked in forever. I got a ton of equity, and even though my rents have been climbing for a long time, and so and there's still inflation. Like, even if I'm worried about jobs or things like that, like, what if in that recessionary environment, the thing I say, the most important thing for me to do is not sell my house? Like, does housing hold up or even help pull us out of a potential recession? Or is there another scenario where, like, the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, recession's going to happen, people are going to start panicking, and they're going to sell everything? What do you think is more likely for housing in the next recession?
It's a great question. There's two sides of this ledger. So on the one side, I think you have this sort of structural factors pushing for more housing demand. The millennial household formation, remote work making housing more affordable, pushing people to buy housing in areas where they build more. Those are structural factors that I don't think are going to be significantly dinged by especially what would probably be a minor recession, right? Like the Fed raising rates too fast. I don't think inflation has become so unanchored that they really need to go wild. This isn't 1982 or whatever. Powell's not going to have to pull a Volcker moment, I don't think. So I don't think we're going to have the kind of major crash that's going to upset those structural things. And in that case, I do think you're right. Those forces, because they've got structural momentum behind them, could be something that helps push us through that correction. What I would say on the other hand is the extent to which house prices have become so divorced from fundamentals is the kind of thing that doesn't usually land smoothly, right? And it's really easy to look in history and always say, well, this time is different with house prices, but this isn't very scientific, right, to say this. But when house prices get that high, your spidey sense goes off, and this doesn't, this is risk, right? Like, this is risk that we are in a mispricing point. So that's not my forecast. But when house prices have moved that much, you can't not think of it as a risk. You absolutely have to think of it as a risk. Great way to sort of wrap up the thinking there. We already blew through an hour, but so let's wrap up with. So you at Upwork, you did some great, really readable publications stuff. What are you doing at Economic Innovation Group? And is that are they going to be Twitterable research? Yeah, I only do easy to understand stuff.
Good.
That's all that I do. So, yeah. So yeah, it'll still be public facing research and reports. And I'm still going to be doing remote work stuff for sure. There's still so many important questions to address there, and so much important research, including on the housing market. There's a lot of, I think, discussed areas of remote work and housing so far, especially when you talk about the impact on the future. How does remote work change the type of communities we build? How does it open up possibilities for new ways of living, new types of communities and new places? There's so much there. And that's just part of it. So yeah, long answer short, I'm definitely going to keep producing readable research. That's great. Where can people find you? You can find me at Twitter on Model Behavior. Model Behavior. Yep. That's the best best place to find it.
Best place to find it. Terrific. Adam, thank you so much for the time today. It was really informative. I'd love to get the context around the data, so validate some of my hypotheses and really plant some seeds for me for good thinking. Thank you so much. And I look forward to much more with you.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening to Top of Mind. See you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.